Welcome to today's MyData Zurich webinar. My name is Peter James and I'm the co-lead of the MyData Zurich Hub. We are organizing events about human-centric data, privacy by design and related topics. I'm excited to announce today's event about digital identities with a specific focus on self-sovereign identity. Let's jump right into it. Welcome to today's webinar about digital identities. And I'm really excited as we have a lot of registrations. We have never had that many registrations, so this shows that the topic is really interesting, and specifically after the negative vote in Switzerland, there's a high expectation that we need digital identities. I admit the title is a little bit flashy, so very likely we won't be able to give all the answers today, but we can show at least a few concepts, and that's the purpose of today's webinar. And what occurred to me during this EID discussion is there is an increasing trend from centralized solutions towards decentralized solutions, and today's webinar is about some potential platforms, how this can be achieved. But before we go into the topic, I would like to make a few announcements. So the usual introduction to MyData. MyData is a global organization, non-profit organization. And just to remind everybody with the logo, the personal data is everywhere, and the purpose of MyData is obviously to protect this personal data. And here I have the official drawing with my unofficial comments on it underneath. So it all started out with in the early days with the API-centric world, and I call that the data stone age. So data was going back and forth. And then after a while, the big tech companies came into play and had all the data on their servers, and with the expectation that the data belongs to them. So I usually call that the data middle age. And people start to realize now that the data, specifically the personal data, belongs to the individual and not to the operator of the server. So it became human-centric. So that is very likely the future of dealing with personal data. Just to give you a brief intro into this MyData purpose. Then we have a MyData Zurich Hub, and you see the players here. It's André Kudra. Unfortunately, he's not able to make it today. Daniela Gunz, Pauline, she's with us today, and myself as a co-lead of the hub. We were founded at the beginning of 2019. We had about 13 or 14 meetups so far, so every 2 months, more or less. We are hosted by the Swiss Data Alliance, so there's a very close cooperation. And initially we were focusing on hands-on workshops where this is possible. And now in COVID times, we have a little bit of different approach, as you will see. I would also like to announce a few upcoming events which we have. And as we are talking about SSI today, there are 2 more events or webinars. One is about data economy for the vaccination passport. It will also be based on SSI technology with Paul Knowles, who is a specialist on this topic. So it's on May 5th. Then there will be another one. This one will be in German. It's about data economy versus the business models, with a specific example of the car dossier, which is a project in Switzerland, which is also partially based on SSI technologies. So it's more about business models, and again with a specific example. And there's another one which we had to reschedule one more time. It's about the electronic health record in Switzerland, the elektronisches Patientendossier. We had to reschedule it because it must be a physical workshop. We want to issue the health records, and we need to identify the persons with their physical identity card. So we need a physical presence, and due to COVID effects and also due to project delays, we had to reschedule it a few times. So it's now in September. We really hope we can run it by then. With that said, I would also already like to jump into the introduction of our guest presenters. So first of all, many thanks to both of you for spending the time with us. It's André Kudra, who's a well-known guest in the meantime here and in similar topics. So he's the CIO of esatus AG, and I really want to point out that esatus is a MyData operating company. There was a prior recording, so for those who are interested, they can recall it. And he's also on the board of the Bundesverband of IT-Sicherheit, so he's very involved in these topics for many years. And our second presenter is Dr. Philippe Page, who's the chair of the trustee of the board of Human Colossus Foundation. Very innovative concept, and he's also a trustee on the board of the Sovereign Foundation, and you will certainly hear something about this. So how's the setup for today? Contrary to our physical meetings, we make the webinars only 1 hour. And the reason is, after a long day of screen time, people are typically tired and hungry, and they can't make it for longer than an hour. So we have a sort of a mixed setup. We have typically 1 hour with a half an hour presentation, a half an hour question and answers, and then you have an unofficial part for those who still have energy. So our presenters will be available a little bit longer for more questions, but the official part ends after 1 hour. So with that said, as we have two presenters today, we have about 15, maybe max 20 minutes. And it will be a very short introduction, and then there will be room for questions and discussions from the audience. And depending on the number of participants, we will do it either by the chat function, or if there are not so many participants, raising the hand and asking the questions directly. So with that intro, I would like to hand over directly to our first presenter. Oh, one more thing actually. For those who are interested in the MyData topics, so you can join the organization. So if you want to become a member and you want to deal with a little bit more with MyData, so that's the link, /join obviously. So there you can become a member if you want to be more involved with MyData activities. So after this intro, now handing over to the first presenter, André. Thank you very much for spending the time. Floor is yours.
Thank you. My pleasure. I will also directly share my screen. So give me 1 second. So we will talk about self-sovereign identities. I will give you a brief intro in the concept as such, and I will give you also a couple of insights how this works and how we can apply it practically today. So you should be able to see my screen now, at least I hope, with the presentation. Yes. Self-sovereign identities, digital identities, what next? Okay, good. So getting right in, maybe a very brief info about esatus. We have, for those of you who have known the logo, we have just done a brand relaunch basically. We are in the space of self-sovereign identity since 2015, and we build bridges between the technology of today and tomorrow. And yeah, so we also have a strong software development branch in the company, and we cover the topics of identity and access, governance, risk and compliance, IT security, and development operations, which is basically the software development area. We have a very broad exposure in the space. So we are a sovereign founding steward. We are a member of Trustee IP, steering and founding member. Pete already mentioned it. I'm also a board member of Teletrust IT Security Association in Germany. I chair the blockchain working group and the secure platform working group there. And for Sovereign, I'm also a board of trustee members, as Philippe was also presenting today. And for ID Union, this is something where we are very active. We will come to that in the end of basically the presentation. So what's on for the next 15 minutes? I will give you a briefing into SSI. What is this? I will give you an introduction into ID Union, which is a large-scale German self-sovereign identity initiative. And then we will have questions and answers in the broader round. So briefing SSI, let's start with that. So those of you who have been in the self-sovereign identity world already probably know this trust triangle, which I usually present as an entry point. It's from the 2018 Sovereign white paper, and it basically shows the key stakeholders in the self-sovereign identity ecosystems. You have an issuer, you have an owner, or today we call them more holder, and the verifier. And these are in a trust relationship already, and particularly the verifier knows the issuer and trusts the data that the issuer provides. And the key fact here is that there doesn't need to be a direct connection from an IT perspective between issuer and verifier, because the owner or holder today holds all the personal data about himself in his personal wallet app. And the issuer basically issues this verified data, which is cryptographically proven into the wallet app of the holder, and he can use it with the verifier completely independently in full own control of the data that he wants to share with the verifier on request only. And the key thing here is we have verifiable credentials. So we have verifiable claims, which is basically one attribute, which are packaged into one verifiable credential, which is issued by the issuer to the holder in his wallet app, and then he can use it on. And I will give you a brief demo also. And so just so that you see that, this is the esatus wallet app, which holds my employee credential. If I click on info, you see all the details about me. This is basically a credential that has been issued by my company for me as an employee, and I can use it to log in to certain applications, which is one basic, very basic use case we can take a look at. So moving on, where does self-sovereign identity come from? So I usually compare it to centralistic PKI systems, because we are moving well-known public key infrastructures into a decentralized model. And in the centralistic PKI, we have obviously standardized methods which are globally productively applied. You have certificate authorities which are doing the services as trust providers. The regulatory frameworks are clearly defined, and the certificate content is solidly defined in X509 and similar. And in the end, you have this as a centralistic service, which works quite well, but you have it also as a single point of failure. And in the new decentralized networked SSI world, you can basically have any participant being an issuer of verifiable credentials. So this is kind of a similarity to PKI. As verifiable credential can be compared to PKI certificate, but the content can be completely flexibly defined, and the issuer is basically his own certificate authority for the credentials. And this is already been adopted throughout the world in various cases. Big industry players are getting into the systems, and the certificate authorities in the classic PKI world are already looking into business models based on SSI. And the key piece is that an issuer has a public DID on such a network and can be identified by this one, and can issue verifiable credentials based on schemas that he writes himself. And for the application space, this is actually something that is used in various ways. So self-sovereign identity is not just a single thing. It's usually a term that works well in the technology space. It's a paradigm. It's also an ecosystem term, and so on. But in general, it's the way into a completely decentralized future where we can enable digital processes without having to define APIs upfront, and can be implementing very flexibly things that we want to build in a network world. Okay, so showing this authentication use case very quickly based on verifiable credentials. So I've already mentioned it. We can use it for an easy process to log into an application. For this, we can just scan a simple QR code. I will then get a proof request, so the request for opening data to the verifier in my wallet app. And if I approve the data sharing, then the backend will verify the validity of the data that I've been showing, and then I will get access to the system I would like to. And this is just a very, very simple and easy use case. And this completely relies on me as the user, as the holder of the data, if I want to present it or not. And based on this, a decision will be taken. I can access the system or not. So to make it more tangible, I will give you a demo based on the credential that you have seen. So this is now our internal system. I will quickly go into the wiki, which is our Confluence system for knowledge management. And as described, I will scan the QR code. I see that I have a proof request, that I have to share certain data for being logged in. So I have to share my user ID, my employer, and the expiration date. And if I click send, the proof request will be answered. And voila, the magic has happened. I am logged in. So this is our production system. It's a simple Atlassian Confluence system which supports standard authentication and authorization mechanisms. And basically this can be adapted to any type of contemporary authentication or authorization platform. So basically we can support any type of SAML, OAuth2, OpenID Connect. We can even now replace the Windows login with verifiable credential. We can write to LDAP directories like AD and Azure ID. You can do SCIM. We can connect to databases and so on. So basically, the authentication and authorization use case can be adapted to the world that everyone knows today. All right, so that was a quick insight into SSI. Now I will give you a brief intro into ID Union, which is a large-scale project in Germany for implementing self-sovereign identity. This is a co-funded project which is supported by the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs. And it's basically building on Hyperledger Indy and Hyperledger Aries technologies, which are applied also in Sovereign, in Findy, and others. And is basically consisting of now, I think, 30-something partners. You see here the latest status that is in the presentation. It has 15 main members, and these are the core members of the consortium, which are also receiving funds from the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs. They actually have to double up the money, so the project is running for 3 years. The funding volume is 15 million, so all the partners have to bring basically the same amount also for implementing the use cases. And we have an ever-growing list of associated partners who also want to participate. They don't receive funding from the public funds, but they can nevertheless participate in the activities. So yeah, I explained that we are using the good stuff of distributed ledger and SSI. So this is the fundament of this project as well. And it's, even though it's rooted in Germany, it has an aim to cover basically all of Europe, and in the statutes of the legal entity that will govern the network, it's even beyond EU only. It is including also UK, Norway, and Switzerland. So these are the technology components that we have already seen, the wallet app interacting with the ledger. And this is basically the ID Union test ledger that is established today. We have a couple of partners of the consortium already running this test network, and we have already set this up last year in the competition phase of the ID Union project. And you see that we are covering a wide variety of verticals for delivering 35 or even more use cases. Okay, to cut it short, I will only give you a bit more info of what is the governance organization doing, because ID Union is not just a project, it is also an organization which is supposed to be a European cooperative, which is a legal entity type that is not so widely known. It requires that 2 organizations from 2 different EU member states get together and found the cooperative. And basically this organization will be used to execute the governance over the network and will manage the stewards, which is the node operators. So actually the organizations providing a node in the network. It will govern the endorsers and the transaction authors, which are eligible for writing transactions to the ledgers, which is the endorsers, and transaction authors, which can be basically anyone who wants to write to the network. And it will also cover the funding model, the managing of the stewards, and the governing of the network, and the monitoring and the SLA management. Yeah, so this are all the verticals with the different use cases that are already planned. And so key is that we want to have complete interoperability between all the different standards that are out there in the world, which is a core topic for us and other members as well already. And the use cases are supposed to have a very broad adoption, as this is also a publicly funded project. Obviously, citizens should use the technology that comes out of it every day and in many different ways. All right, this was basically the quick intro into SSI. We can now move on to the next speaker, and obviously we'll then have more time for questions when the introductions are done.
Thank you very much, André. we have already one question about the presentation, if that will be available. André, I assume you will send me the PDF and then I can make it available to the audience.
Yeah, I will send you the link to the ID Union website, which contains the infos about the project, and I will send you obviously the presentation I am sharing now. Yeah.
Very good. So I'm going to publish that on Meetup, and the recorded video on YouTube. I'll also put in the links there, so for all those who are interested in the video and the recording and also the material. So with that said, I swiftly move on to our next presenters. So it's so that was more the technical framework, and Philippe is also the specialist for semantic interoperability, which is one of his key items. With that said, Philippe, also thank you very much for making yourself available, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen. Okay, do you all see my screen right now?
Yeah, it's working fine.
Okay, perfect. So in the previous 15 minutes, André gave a short introduction of SSI, and he mentioned something very important. SSI opens the door to the future of decentralization, a decentralized world, sorry, where we will interact very differently over the networks. What I will be doing in the next 15 minutes is elaborate on that and show a way on some elements that are enabled by the existence of SSI. André has shown how many use cases, how many proof of concept will be carried out through the ID Union project. There are projects like that in Canada, in Finland. So this is something that will be taking place all over the world. Here I will concentrate on moving from SSI to how it will impact the whole data economy. So I will do that by presenting the foundation, because actually the Human Colossus Foundation is all about that. We call that the dynamic data economy. So the presentation of the foundation will be actually the start of this work. Then I will move on to what are the components needed to create really trustworthy data flows, and end up with a conclusion that goes back to the human centricity and maybe the impact on this digital identity we spoke in Switzerland. So first, the Human Colossus Foundation. It all started actually in Helsinki in 2019, where after discussion with Paul-Olivier Dehaye from MyData Geneva, he told me, comes to MyData Global in Helsinki, you'll see, you'll learn a lot of things. At that time, I didn't know MyData. And over there, I met a few people, and the result took place in Geneva a few months later, where we created the Human Colossus Foundation. Why did we create another foundation to discuss this topic and to build something? Actually, at MyData, we realized that there were a number of people working on various concepts. Some were technological, some were more on the governance side, and there was really a flurry of use cases. And we felt that were actually had a very strong technological component, obviously everything being digital. So we wanted to create a home where a number of partners could interact together and share their experience so that we could build a complete data flow, also not only from the technology, but up to the user, to the end, to the economy actually. And why we created also the foundation is because we had two components that we believed would be useful. Is and very strong view about how SSI should be implemented. And the other one is about semantic, how people should actually exchange the data. So we started in 2019 by first building components. We are part of Hyperledger. We co-convene the IRIS working group there. We're also part of the Indie working group. That means that's how I got to know André and his work. We are also doing work as part of the Decentralized Identity Foundation. And we were one of the founding members of Trust over IP, where Paul Knowles actually convened the Inputs on Semantic working group, where we are bringing these ideas of sharing semantic, which I will introduce later, this decentralized semantic next to this decentralized identity, which is coming from SSI. And this combination of decentralized identity with decentralized semantic, that is really the building block of the foundation, which we work out with partners to build a totally decentralized platform. Our work is totally compatible. We use with open standards. We're always based on the WSWC standards and other. And this year we are also part of the Swiss National Standard Organization on the SEN, where we start to take, we are participating in a few working groups. What we have built was part of two projects, which we worked with grants of the European Union in the Next Generation Internet. We had one first project where we about data portability. I will not speak too much about this project because it's going to be one of the cornerstone of Paul's presentation next week. But it's a project where we were trying to we built a prototype to digitalize the yellow book passport of the World Health Organization in the case of yellow fever. Why yellow fever? Because this is known vaccine, and we didn't want to touch the current problems related to the COVID-19. Okay, so yeah, that was the nice slide to show you that it started in Helsinki. I will go back to it. Creation of MyData Foundation is now in Geneva, and that's the slide where I was. Okay, so the first project, data portability, was really to use decentralized identity coupled with this notion of decentralized semantic to have a complete end-to-end workflow for someone getting a credential, as André showed before, and using that credential with a verifier that is working in a totally different environment into a total governance. So that's why we use the concept of passport, because when you create an application for any digital type of passport in a certain environment, you don't know where exactly the user will be using this passport later on. This is why we speak about multi-stakeholder governance, but also the point that you need to make sure that the passport will be readable according to the rule and governance of the country you will be using it. So this was the notion of data portability using semantic. Then the second project, which is run in parallel, is about a dynamic data sharing hub with consent flow. It's run within the SIF Lab. The SIF Lab has been created last year. It's part of the European Union effort to promote a self-sovereign identity infrastructure toward Europe. There are some other companies part of this SIF Lab like SIGPA, the Swiss company, and some others. In that project, what we wanted to show is how you can actually keep the user consent throughout a process where his data ends up into a data sharing hub or a database, if you want, and that is subsequently searched by other parties. The example we use in that for that prototype is clinical trial, where a pharmaceutical company performing a clinical trial will actually search for patient. Patient will consent to be part of the trial. Data will be enriched as part of the trial, which could take years. And upon consent of both the pharmaceutical company on its enriched data and the patient, creating a way to share data with researchers, with other participants of the ecosystem, and having this consent flow that is at the transaction level. So that compares to the cookie, for example, where when we all have this habit of clicking yes when we are asked to accept cookies or not. Here it will be a bit different. It will be at the transaction level. And this is where the semantic is very important, because at the transaction level, you need to understand the consent, the context in which the consent is given. But doing that effort allows you to give a consent that is really tailored to the need of the user, which the humans behind can maybe better understand, but can also put limits in time, for example. So these two projects, were somehow assuming that SSI is in place because we had it totally built in. So the key takeaway of this, the mission of our foundation, this dynamic data economy, is that yes, clearly self-sovereign identity opens the opportunity and enables a decentralized world, a digital world. But this is just the beginning. So you need to bring trust back into the system, and this is not just the credential. It is also about the content of the data. So what do we need to make these data flows trustworthy? At the Human Colossus Foundation, we often say that data is like electricity. It has value when it flows, but it is costly when it stagnates. So obviously, this is an image to show a different way of saying that data should not be locked into silos or controlled centrally, as Pete showed in his introduction. Now, what we are working on is actually bringing a balance between the digital and the physical world, because the way we do things in the physical world is obviously not the same we do in the digital world. And that will be very important when we come to the notion of identity, because we all have a functional notion of identity into a real physical world. We know what is our Swiss passport. We know exactly what it is, how we use it, how we don't use it. And here, this is something that is less clear in the digital world. I think that has an impact on the recent quotation. So this is all about authentication on the networks. So a quick reminder to understand the complexity of the process that SSI solves is actually we need to look at the amazing growth of web interaction since the beginning 1990s to 2020. We not only started with a few hundred thousands of users that usually had one or two devices, but we quickly moved to a situation where today we are in the hyper-connectivity. We have more than 3 billion users, and most of the users have many more devices, not only personally, but at work, and there's all the detectors, because IoTs and all these devices are also on the network. So decentralization techniques also had to evolve. They went from what I call administrative, because you have an intermediary, what we show in Pete's slide earlier, the central actors that actually administer this authentication. So we went through the whole evolution of logins, and that moves from centralized control to decentralized control. And SSI is actually this piece where we can move from administrative to an algorithmic authentication, where the authentication is done through a decentralized ledger. That's the bottom of the triangle shown by André before. It's like you don't actually have to involve a third party to really identify yourself. And I put here Sovereign 2018 because that's the date that Sovereign produced the first ledger that anyone could use that was really focused on identity, and its development is going on. Now, I also put 2021, and you notice that I didn't put it at the end of the arrow because I think we are still very far from a total decentralized control. But what is currently happening with self-sovereign identity shows a really interesting path toward this world. Decentralized control will only be achieved when you have a total self-certification, not only for people, but also for things and organization. And that's the future towards things are going. Now, we come to semantic. So it's all about data harmonization. If you decentralize the authentication, you will have more people controlling the data. But that means you will have many more edge points, many more entry points into the data flows. So all these endpoints needs to interact together. And here we also don't want to be in the same situation where we are forced with centralized actor imposing to you what is a private information, what is the meaning of the data you are changing. That is something that needs to be adapted, where both sides of the transaction needs to basically agree, yes, this is a type of data, but this is how I understand it. So if you see authentication as to understand with who you are speaking of, now harmonization is about to know what is being shared. At this Human Colossus Foundation, we work on what we call overlays capture architecture. This is the components we are building, which treats basically the exchange of data, the schemas that are behind the exchange of data, a little bit like the people who know about digital photography and Photoshop, like layers of you can put on a picture to transform the picture. Here, each of these layers can be changed without touching the whole schema. That means you can find, and they are all cryptographically linked, so it's one single body based on a very simple schema base that is easy to share, but then changes can be cryptographically followed. So that means people can exactly know in which layers, what is the meaning of the attribute, and if for a certain system the attribute needs to be changed, it can be changed, but in a way that is signed. There's a signature on this change, and the coherence of the whole schema is still cryptographically signed as a whole. And a simple example, if you create a digital passport in English and you move to China, you want to have all the labels in Chinese. With the translation in Chinese, if you just do a system for 2 countries, maybe you can do it. But if you want to do an open system where me as a user is totally free to travel in any country, I can go to Mongolia, I can go into a remote region of Canada where they will speak a totally different language, even not French and English. This is the flexibility you need to have. So the translation will be coming from official sources, but still be compatible. Paul Knowles is behind actually this component, so he will give much more information on that on the talk next week in the same forum. So this is the second component. And when you have these 2 components together, you can really go into a world where you can think of multi-stakeholder governance. That is, you can design a solution where at the design time, you know that it's going to be used into a country, into a context that you cannot plug in at within the solution at the time you produce the software. That means you have to leave the user using his wallet in various applications, in various contexts. And this is what we call the decentralized governance. And we are working on an architecture, which we call the Moushead model, where we not provide data flows in the standard way. We first start by assigning a role to the user. And this is where this model can be seen as a data management model, but it can also be seen as an economic model, because we split the world between the subject and what we call the purpose-based service provider. The purpose-based service provider are basically any economic actor that is doing an economic activity that is where the purpose is not production of data. We all produce data in our daily life, in our economy, but this is not where we value our economic inputs. On the right-hand side, we have the insights-based service provider, and that's where the whole analytics, where the added value in the economy is coming from actually analyzing the data and producing added value from the data. On the center, you have this multi-stakeholder governance. And that's where, if you have, that's the governance that will dictate how all these actors interact. To be able to do that, you need absolutely the two other components, SSI and this decentralized harmonization. Typically for MyData, a MyData operator in that picture is one of these data governance authorities. So once you have these 3 components, decentralized authentication, semantic, and governance, this is where you can build trustworthy data flow. By trustworthy here, it means that me as a user or as a human entering my data in the flow have a better control about what the data is, who accesses the data, what the data is used for, and which governance actually controls this data, because there will be many governance. So the last step, how does that ties back to national identity? And I call that citizen versus digital citizen. And here, I think the message is pretty simple. And that's maybe one of the points that was not clearly passed at the time of the votation. Digital human centricity is not about controlling one EID. In that picture, yes, we need an ID that is the digital equivalent of my passport. But in my real life, I don't show my passport every time I buy something, every time I go to a shop, I have other credentials. So it has to be moved, obviously, in the mind of people that digital human centricity is about controlling many digital identifiers. And that's where self-sovereign identity becomes really a tool for the future, because each of these self-sovereign identity you create with your government, with your bank, with your friends, with your family, whoever, these are like different identity. And one of them is actually foundational, that's the identity that the federal government will give me. But it doesn't mean that this identity has to be shared in centrally or has to be the only identity that opens doors when I want to buy a train ticket. And to move from identity to identifier, I think it's something easier to pass if you have this concept of self-sovereign identity, as André showed in his one of his first slides, because the bottom of the triangle, the relation between the verifier and the issuer does not require a direct connection between the two. So mixing these three things, you can go from SSI to really this notion of algorithmic authentication that provides the technology, making the digital human centricity possible. So I will end here. It was very short, but it's a complex topic.
Thank you very much, Philippe. I appreciate it's a lot of information. It's also quite complex. So for those who are more interested, there is this Human Colossus Foundation website, so you can spend a little bit more time. I assume, Philippe, you will send me your slides as well.
Sure.
Then I'll make that available to the audience. So we have about 15 minutes remaining for questions, and I suggest we try it out first with through the chat function, and I'll read it out. If you have less participants, then maybe we can try to ask the questions directly. Maybe if you raise your hand and then ask your question. Are there questions? I guess everybody's overwhelmed now. Question from my side. My background is not so much in the technology. I'm more coming from the data management side. I love very much the approach about the semantics and the interoperability, because a lot of discussions are on a technical level, which is certainly necessary. You are providing a very general framework. Are you already adopting specific existing standards? And I take an example. Dick will certainly know that. In the healthcare sector, there is now a discussion about fire resources. So it's HL7 is the organization which defines these business standards, if you like, or healthcare standards, and technically it's implemented as a fire standards. Are you based on these existing standards? How are you working? How are you bringing that into your semantics framework?
OCA is not a new standard. It's more aimed to be like a universal language to interoperate between standards. So you mentioned actually a good standard, because in our work, in our prototype for the clinical trial, we face two things. On one side, you have FHIR HL7 being used by the pharmas, but on the other side, you have CDISC used by other players in the ecosystem. So if you want to have data sharing in the whole ecosystem, you will have to basically have multiple stakeholders working with different standards. So for that European project, we actually built a bridge between FHIR and OCA. So that means we can bring any FHIR data into an OCA format, and then it can be shipped to other formats. So in this case, we are not based on one standard, but as time will go on, we will integrate OCA in various standards. At this point, I can also say that OCA has nothing to do with SSI per se. OCA is also a bridge to legacy system. It can be implemented, the OCA logic can be implemented totally outside of the SSI thinking. These two things are not related.
So it's sort of a mapping of various standards into a common view then?
Yes, it is a mapping of the existing standard into this layered structure, which allows them to be passed to the other side of the transaction that can read it. Obviously, if it will be FHIR on both sides, it's easy, because then you have the data flying, you use the FHIR standard. But the point of decentralization is to always work where you do not know exactly what will be the standard of the other guy. You do not know what is the authentication system of the other guy. So André, with ID Union, they all work within this INDI framework. Normally, interoperability will mean that any POC project they have at ID Union should be interoperable, because these INDI networks are, by design, interoperable between them. So this is a huge benefit from the previous API world, or you have to build standard. So what we are building is the same decentralization concept, but on the level of semantic.
Okay, so we are getting the first questions. So one is, what are, in your point of view, the immediate relevance for the EID debate in Switzerland? Who wants to take on this one? I guess it's more for André.
Yeah, I can start, and Philippe obviously is well suited because he's also a Swiss citizen and knows about this probably more than I, and you all know more about that than I, because I was following the whole debate in the last weeks before the vote very intensely and got involved, and I felt, oh wow, this is very good the discussion. And if we had pursued this discussion earlier and had driven it more into the SSI world and the SSI understanding, and made people understand that even with the EID law as it was planned, we could have enabled the SSI ecosystem. Maybe we can even do it now without it, but that's a different story. Then maybe the vote would have been differently. And I think we have a very good point in time to actually skip all this legacy kind of identity stuff and now move in Switzerland directly to an SSI-based ecosystem, which I think would be very interesting and fruitful for everyone. So to give you a little bit of an insight, we are in the EU. We are bound to the IDAS regulation, which is kind of a very heavyweight regulatory framework for managing trust services, including identity. And this is all basically old school PKI driven stuff with a German EID card and so on. This was never really adopted, definitely not in Germany. Everyone has the EID card now in his pocket for 10 years, but no one is using it. So I think we have a great potential for enabling real digitalization with the SSI-based ecosystems to make it easier adoptable by everyone involved, be it public sector or be it private sector. So I think this is a very timely topic and a very good point in time to make it now happen without all the heavyweight legacy stuff in the back. So in Switzerland, I think all go for SSI, and what I see, there is lots of good discussion in this direction already going on. So I'm a big fan, and I will support it. We are already working in the SSI space in Switzerland, and I'm looking forward to working with more people and organizations. Yeah,
that's why we have these webinars, to make interested persons aware of the current activities. Anything what you would like to add, Philippe?
Yeah, I think on a more practical level, because I'm Swiss, so that means I am biased because I had to vote, but I'm also a little bit impatient to get things moving, because we have been discussing for a while. So I think if I had to do a message in one line is the actors, and that goes from the government to the people that can implement, needs to know that there are alternatives to the current data server models. Yeah. And just consider seriously the alternatives, and it's not very complicated. I mean, do a deep dive of what André is doing with ID Union, but this is just Germany and Europe. Finland is doing something, Canada is doing something. There are alternatives popping up a little bit all over the world. So having this notion of alternative is actually the thing I will try to have it more institutionalized, that there's a clear distinction. Because in the end, I felt that Swiss people had understood what SSI means, even though they never heard the word. Because how could the population vote no to something that was not so clearly, it was technical. So it went back to emotion, went back to human-centric things. Now, my view, because I know a little bit about the subject, what I was disturbed is about interoperability. So people never really understood, even though there might be many providers of digital identity. What does it mean exactly? Will there be some centralization? Do I have to show it everywhere? But also this fact that, let's say, my system is interoperable with Apple. Is it really decentralized? No. The day Apple changed something, I have to change something in my system. The day I change something, good luck to make Apple change it also. So I think there was this feeling that interoperability was treated on the technical level, not on the societal level. That's why we believe you need really all the actors to really look into the stack, from the digital identity up to the governance, how is this data governed? And if I can make a little bit of publicity, I will be giving 2 talks as part of the Clusis, one next week on May 4th, where it will be this question of alternatives that will be discussed.
Thank you very much. I can add 1 or 2 more sentences. So I know that the Swiss Sign Group is currently looking into these SSI concepts. They have to think about their business model, because in the past, the business model was they would be paid for every login. And now, as they don't know about the logins, it's different. So it's all a commercial view. And I think the CEO is still a little bit in the old world, maybe. So there are more questions as time is moving on. One is for André. What kind of identifiers do you use for access, for example, to Azure with your QR code? That's pretty technical, André.
Yeah, I will. I'm sharing just one additional slide, because this may help to understand how this works. So actually, we have in the back end, we have a rule engine, which is from the paradigm credential-based access control. So basically, we feed this rule engine with data out of the credentials that we request. And what we have seen in the demo, we use a simple rule to identify if I'm eligible to access the system. And the simple rule was, am I an employee of esatus AG? So I shared esatus AG as an attribute. I shared the validity time frame of the credential, and also a user ID, which is just a technical means of handling the login. And based on the data that is fed into the rule engine, we basically act on the other end like an identity provider. And that's the reason why we can interact with SAML or to OpenID Connect and write to any type of LDAP directories, because it basically translates between the input data from the credential via the rule into the actual decision to access the system. And these rules can be complex. You can feed in data from all types of credentials, whatever you think is necessary, and then it will basically invoke the necessary authentication or authorization step as a regular identity provider would do. Does that help?
I don't know who brought up the question, so there is...
There's one more question. With other words, you use username and password for Microsoft? No, actually, I'm probably not the best person to talk to this in particular, but we have implemented a system for this Windows credential provider. So this means actually there is some kind of token stored on the system which will be called, but I cannot tell you the exact details for the Windows authentication, but there is no channeling of usernames and passwords back and forth. So it's just using the regular protocols where it is applicable, and for the specific case of Windows login, I'm not the right person to explain it. Sorry.
Basically, if I get it right, you pass the result of the confirmation. The confirmation could either be password and username is okay, or the confirmation could be that the credential was okay.
Yeah, well, username password definitely never the case. So we basically invoke on the protocol side the necessary response. So basically what you have seen in the case that I demonstrated, it was a SAML authentication where there's nowhere username and password involved. It's just passing on the token, which is created when the rule is positively answered. So that's all that happens. There is nowhere ever a username and password in the works. Yeah.
So token could either come from username and password in the old world, or from the credential in the new world.
Exactly. So we basically replace username and password with we also call it fact-based access control, because you provide the facts and then the authentication or authorization happens.
Okay, so I hope that helps. I know it's pretty technical. So again, a question about the EID. Okay. So, okay, they're obviously very happy. They're happy for the organization. One more is about the EID. As we are running out of time, just to conclude, André Gollier wanted to attend, and I had a briefing with him. I also asked him, how are we progressing from here? And it's currently a little bit different about the EID, and he is also some sort, maybe I say frustrated about, there was a lot of effort to convey the important messages about the EID, And it was very difficult to get the key stakeholders to understand all the relevant concepts. So as I said at the beginning, with the title is a little bit flashy. We don't have the final answers today. So what next? I can't answer it for the time being, but there will, as we said, there will be more events of this type. So as we already mentioned, next time around, it's with Paul Knowles, a specific example about the vaccination, how that could look like. And he showed me a demo in the briefing, so I'll take it up with him. So maybe it gets a little bit clearer if you see the demo there. And the other thing is about the car dossier, which is a specific case where you see the business model. And if there's a need, so you can send me a mail or you can send it to the meetup. If you would like to see more in this topic, then let me know, and then we'll organize some follow-up events. On the EID, it's right now a little bit difficult. So that was pretty much for it. It's basically similar to MS Authenticator. Maybe if you can quickly go into that one, and then I think we conclude the official part. So André is on André, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, I just had to clarify something regarding the next appointment we have. Sorry, yeah, I'm here.
There is one more question about sorry about the basic question, but is this similar to MS Authenticator? It's
well, actually, it's more like in the backend, it acts like an identity provider, like other systems that you know from the classic world. You can check out the data that is presented on our website, and there is some more technical details, and I think there's also some kind of technical paper that would explain it in more detail. But always you can reach out to me. We can organize also a tech discussion with our developer teams.
Okay, I'm happy to take that one. So with that said, a lot of people have to leave, obviously. We are still available for a few more questions for those who are still energy, not tired, not hungry. So with that, I conclude the official part. Thank you very much for both of you presenters for the active contributions. And with that, I stop the recording.